Good morning. Today is the fourth day of the first Adar, the 13th of February. We are up to the third reading of Parshat Terumah. And in the third reading, we read about the construction of the menorah, the candelabra. We've talked about the menorah in the past. Last year we spoke about it with regard to Parshat Balotcha, if you remember, the first reading. We won't discuss it today. We're going to focus on the second part of the reading, which is how the tent part of the tabernacle was constructed. What do we mean by a tent? The tabernacle was not a permanent dwelling. It was something that was carried around in the wilderness. It was put together and taken apart and put together and taken apart. So obviously it couldn't have a permanent roof. The roof was made out of tapestries. These tapestries were made from different materials. And what we want to look at now is specifically chapter 26, verse 1. I'm going to read it in English with the Vishnevsky additions, just so that we can finish it quickly and get to the point. God then gave Moses instructions concerning the coverings that formed the roof and external wall coverings of the tabernacle. You shall have them make the first cover of the tabernacle out of 10 tapestries. These tapestries will be woven out of threads composed of 24 strands, 6 strands of linen twined together, 6 strands of turquoise wool twined together, 6 strands of purple wool twined together, and 6 strands of scarlet wool twined together. You shall have them make them with a woven design of cherubs, meaning of those same cherubim that we had on top of the covering of the ark. These cherubs will have the appearance of eagles on one side of the tapestries and of lions on the other. Of course, the cherubim that were on the ark were in the shape of a human face. The length of each tapestry shall be 28 cubits, and the width of each tapestry shall be 4 cubits, all the tapestries being of the same size. 5 tapestries shall be attached to one another by sewing, and the other 5 shall likewise be attached to one another by sewing. So we see that there's one way of attaching the tapestries, which is to sew them together. You shall have them make loops of turquoise wool along the edge of the tapestry at the end of the first set, and you shall have them do the same along the edge of the endmost tapestry of the second set. You shall have them make 50 loops. Now listen to this. 50 loops on the one tapestry, and she'll have them make 50 loops along the edge of the tapestries of the second set, each loop being exactly opposite its counterpart. And then you make 50 golden clasps, and you shall join the 2 sets of tapestries to each other with the clasps, so that the cover of the tabernacle will become one. So there were really 5 and 5 tapestries that were sewn together on each side, and then the 5 on one side and the 5 on the other side are connected together. They're not sewn by loops or holes made on the edge of the one set, and holes and loops made on the edge of the other set, and then clasps made of gold that connect them together, and then it becomes one long tapestry with 10 parts. The word that we want to look at today is probably one of the first things that convinced me, I simply didn't know better back then, that what Rav Ginsburg was teaching was not just more of the same type of Torah that I had been hearing until then. I'd been in yeshivot for many years, and Talmudical academies for many years. I'd heard a lot, I'd tried to study myself. But I had never heard anyone who had a system. I had never heard anybody who had enough of a bird's eye view of Torah to be able to say that there is a way to study, there is a way to add knowledge, there is a way not only to understand the Torah better, but to actually extend it further out. And what convinced me that here was something different was when I heard him, I think in the first few times that I heard him speak, I heard him explain this verse. And he said, what does it mean that the loops should be exactly opposite one another? Well, if you have loops and you want to connect them together, they have to be exactly lined up. The word really in Hebrew is they have to correspond to one another. But in Hebrew the word is makbilot halulaot. The loops have to be facing each other, meaning makbilot is the word in Hebrew. Before I heard this, I didn't know that the root kabal, kuf bet lamed, does not appear very often in the Torah. In fact, it only appears twice. Here, in our verse 26:5, Exodus 26:5, and then again in the repetition when they actually made it in 3 parshas, and we'll see that it says almost the same thing. They made the loops corresponding to one another, facing one another, makbilot alulaot. Why is this so important? Because if you ask a Hebrew speaker, like most people who speak Hebrew, like me from birth, what does the word kuf bet lamed mean? What does Kabbalah mean? So they'll say, Kabbalah means to receive. But if you don't know about the development of the Hebrew language, and you don't know that in the Pentateuch it's never used in that sense. In the Pentateuch, in the Torah, lekabel doesn't show up as to receive anything. That meaning has to wait until the Persian exile. When the Jews were in Persia, in the time of Esther and Mordechai, we find in the scroll of Esther that usage of the root kuf bet lamed, which then means kimu v'kiblu Yehudim. The Jews received and felt obligated by what they had received in the past, meaning that they took upon themselves a new commitment to performing the Torah, which they had received many generations earlier at Mount Sinai. So we're talking about 1,000 years after this verse was written. The meaning shifted. And there's reasons why it shifted, because in Arabic it means that. There are other Semitic languages where kuf bet lamed means to receive. But when the Torah was given from God, kuf bet lamed only meant correspondence. One thing facing another. Explains Rav Ginsburg, since this is the only source of this root, the original meaning of Kabbalah is to correspond things. It's not to receive, as people imagine, some secret knowledge. It's true. There is also something that you need to receive. Then it becomes, in later generations, they begin to speak about receiving a true tradition from Elijah the prophet, which means to having some kind of inspiration in one's thought. It's still logical and rational thought, but it is an inspiration. It's something that a person wouldn't normally come upon. It's not a conclusion they could come upon usually by themselves. Here what it's saying is that the original basis of Kabbalah is to correspond. What does it mean to correspond? Well, here we have 50 loops on one side, 50 loops on the other side, and perhaps in many ways one of the earliest correspondences that were created in Kabbalistic thought was that the Exodus from Egypt is mentioned 50 times. There's a lot to say about that. What does it mean that it's mentioned 50 times? If you count, you probably find there's more like 70. But there's an explanation what these 50 times is. Again, remember, we're talking about 50 loops. So I'm giving an example, one of the earliest, very complex correspondences that was created in Kabbalah. 50 mentions of the Exodus from Egypt, 50 times in which God is described anthropomorphically in the Torah. God was angered, God's hand, God spoke, things like that. Things that we understand that these things are some kind of metaphor. And 50 questions that God asks of Job at the end of the book and says, can you answer these questions before you come to criticize my ways? In other words, do you understand the depth of the meaning of creation, that you can come and tell me, or you can even to yourself criticize the work that I've done, how I lead the world, how I run it. If you don't understand the answer to these questions, you're probably not at the level that you could really ask a serious question about how I run the world. So 50, 50, and 50, the same idea. And come the sages, and in an incredible understanding of how we should think about revelatory knowledge, they come and say, if there's 50 here and 50 here and 50 here, they correspond to one another. So you can learn from the 50 mentions of the Exodus from Egypt, you can learn something about the 50 questions of Job, and you can learn about the 50 anthropomorphic mentions of God. That, granted, is a very difficult correspondence to make. But if you've mastered one, you can take the knowledge from one and move it on to the next and to the next, each time gaining deeper understanding of the initial set of 50 things. So again, I said that is a very difficult correspondence to make. Rabbi Ginsburg actually made it about 30 years ago in a series of about 60 classes in which he went over each one of these correspondences to explain them in depth. Which anthropomorphic mention of God, which mention of the Exodus, which question asked of Job, why they relate to one another, how they shed more understanding from one to the other. Unfortunately, this was done 30 years ago. We don't have many recordings of it. We have some of them, not all of them. And back then, he used to speak at a level that most people really cannot understand. But he did that. If he would have done it today, he probably would have explained it much more simply in ways that we could all grasp. But that's what we have, and someday we'll get down to publishing it. It's not easy because it's very hard to understand. But there are very simple correspondences that help us understand everything. And this is the idea. We call these the 50, you should know, is also related to what we call the 50 gates of understanding. That's why I've kept saying understanding. Because the 50 gates of understanding are, in the end, the power of drawing a correspondence, drawing a similarity. It's called in Hebrew, mevin davar mitoch davar, understanding one thing from another. There's one set of things that I already know, then I can shed light on another set that has the same number of elements, and they have some connection between them. The simplest example that we've done many times is that we take the 4 letters of God's essential name, Havaya, Yud Kei Vav Kei, and we correspond it to 4 different things that we find. A lot of times we do correspondences between things that have 3 elements in them. We actually were talking yesterday about something that has 3 elements in it. We were talking about the 2 focal points plus the mysterious, unseen focal point of the tabernacle. If you remember, we had the focal point of the ark, the focal point of the altar, the outside altar, and then we said there's a hidden focal point, which is the space between the krubim on the cover. When we have 3 like that, we correspond it to all the threesomes that we know. So we would say the basic threesome that we know is usually submission, separation, sweetening from the Baal Shem Tov. So we would say when it comes to the external altar, that's the state of submitting before God. That's what we do there. The state that we come to in connecting to the Torah that's in the ark is called separation, because separation is to identify entirely and exclusively only with God's Word, with God Himself. That's what we do through the Torah. And then finally we have the sweetening, which is coming and saying that when these 2 things combine together, even what causes the sin, even what requires submission, which is the being, the finite being that we are, when combined together with the infinite nature of the Torah, in between the krubim, leads us to an understanding that God is beyond all our categories. The hidden focal point, and that is the sweetening. Because when you understand that God is beyond all the categories, then even when a person sins, even when he does something wrong, we understand that this is part of the divine plan. Because we can't, in the end, fully define in any way what God is, how he thinks, how things work. We could do the same thing now, by the way, for the 3 sets of the Exodus from Egypt, the anthropomorphisms of God, and finally the questions asked of Job that would be exactly the same. Exodus from Egypt would be the submission. The anthropomorphisms would be identifying with God and understanding how we need something to cling to in order to identify. And then finally, coming to the state of the questions asked of Job, which lead us to understanding that God is beyond all our categories. So this is the nature of Kabbalah. This is what Kabbalah is really about. It's about finding these systems, these models, identifying those that have the same common number of elements, and then trying to extend our knowledge from one to the next. When that happens, when you understand how to do this properly, and it's not easy, then you can extend it to new areas of human knowledge. When you look at something and you say, in photosynthesis, or let's say it like this, within the the photoactive part of the plant, there are 7 different structures. Then we can take these 7 different structures and we can correspond them to the 7 emotive faculties, and we can understand both better. We understand how photosynthesis works better, and we understand better what the emotive faculties are, and so on and so on. And this is the heart of what Kabbalah is about. Thanks for joining today. Hope to see you tomorrow.